Welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine and Chocolate and Coffee, just not necessarily at the same time. There's been a trend over the last decade or so for chocolate and coffee flavoured wine to find their way into the wine drinking space. Now, there have always been notes of mocha, notes of cocoa in wine, and often wonderfully so, but there's always been a subtlety to them. Over the last 10 years or so, we've started to see, moving into the wine world, wines that are overtly chocolate flavoured, coffee themed, wines that pick up on those flavours and really try to promote them. Now, if that's going to make more people drink wine, if it's going to get people into a wine space where they weren't before, then I'm absolutely for it. But it doesn't mean I necessarily have to drink them or overly like them myself. So I've set myself a test today. 4 wines, 2 of them of a chocolate nature, 2 of them more of the coffee persuasion, to see what they're like and to see whether they're gimmicky or whether they're something that I could drink on a more regular basis. And the first of those has absolutely no bones about what it is. This is wine as a large Mars bar. It's the Chocoholic from Darling Cellars. Now, if you were in any doubt as to what this wine is about, the back of the bottle will confirm the unwrapped chocolate bar. And there is a reason to this. Wine doesn't suit everybody's palate. And there are a lot of people who find that wine just doesn't work for them. It's too bitter. It's too unpalatable. They just don't like it. So how do we get people who sit in that space to start drinking wine and maybe make the journey towards what we see as being the more conventional types? And this is an example. And you know straight away it's going to be something that is richer, sweeter, has a more easy palate to it. The kind of wine that says, if you like your reds a little bit sweeter, maybe this is the way to go. And sweet red wine, for me, really not my space. But if you look at a brand like 4th Street, the Distell brand, it's selling in record numbers across Africa because it's found a space and it's found a palate, and a very large collective palate at that. So I'm going to try it. I'll be open about it. I might not really like it, but I certainly understand where it is and the role that it plays in the wine industry. And it is a very important role. So the wines that normally have that chocolate feel, those notes of cocoa, are your Pinotage, your Syrah, maybe a little bit of your Merlot, but it's usually part of a broader picture. It's not often that the chocolate feel will lead a wine, will lead the tasting notes. But this is clearly the intention here. It's marketing as much as anything else, but it's marketing that seems to be working in the modern space. If you want an idea of what this is, go and find a bottle of Merlot, your midweek range, and put it in a blender with a couple of flakes, and this is where you're headed. It's a slightly sweeter wine. If I think back, one of the first proper glasses of wine I had was at a Christmas dinner with a family. I was trying very hard to impress a girl at the table and look dreadfully sophisticated by drinking wine, which I had had almost none of before. And I choked it down manfully. It tasted, to me, dreadful. But then I hadn't drunk any wine before, and the palate was always going to be harsh, bitter, and abrasive. So if you haven't had much wine before, and that's no bad thing at all, everybody needs a starting point, then this is not the worst place to start. It's going to be sweeter than your normal wines. It lacks the subtlety of a lot of others, but it enters you up into the broader wine market, and there's definitely a place for it in the broader space. Chocoholic, chocolate and wine, yeah, you'll do worse. So if the first wine was unashamedly chocolate, this has coffee screaming all over it. You just have to read Coffee Mocha Pinotage to pick that up. It's a KWV wine, and the first place I tasted this was in the town of Turku on the west coast of Finland. You may have heard of the South African IT tycoon Matt Garrett, who ended up marrying a Finnish model. Her family was from Finland. I ended up at the wedding, and this is what we had to drink, a celebration both of South African culture and what wine was available in Finland from South Africa. Now, coffee, much like chocolate, has a history of being able to pick it up, especially in a wine like Pinotage. But again, it's always been in the background. It's been a bit part player rather than the lead actor. But in this case, it's thrust into the spotlight. It's wine, but it's coffee, and it's unashamedly so. I was in Turku. I tried some very interesting things. Finnish vodka, which is a lot better and a lot more subtle than you might imagine. Ate some reindeer, amongst other things, but also had the chance, surprisingly, to try out some of this cafe culture from KWV. I remember it then as being distinctly coffee flavoured, but still not a bad wine. That was about 6 years ago. Time to see if the memory and the present match up. So that's a little more subtle than the chocolate addict's wine of before, but there's still a very pronounced coffee flavour to it. And it's not the worst thing. That coffee at the end in particular gives you that little kick and maybe gets you through a long night of a Finnish wedding, but it's a fairly smooth wine, and being a South African Pinotage, it's got some nice ripe fruit in there as well. And what that coffee does is it possibly replaces some of that earthiness that you might get at the end of a usual Pinotage. It's again like the Chocoholic, not the most subtle of wine, but it's a wine that reflects the fact that many people have a great love of coffee, and just as a love of chocolate might via the Chocoholic get you into the wine market, so this, through a love of coffee, will introduce you to wine and take you into a whole new space. Now, this wine isn't as overt in its chocolate or coffee leanings on its label as the previous two, but it's the wine that played the key role in shifting our understanding of the market in South Africa towards people who really do like that coffee and chocolate feel. I first arrived at Diemersfontein after a round of golf. I played with Dylan Shepherd, the Bafana footballer, and he wanted to try out some wine tasting. He hadn't really done any of it before. So we headed off into Wellington, had a look around, and we actually stopped at Diemersfontein looking for directions to a nice wine estate. And the rather sheepish person we met there said, well, we've actually got some wine of our own if you'd like to try it. And we did, and we tried the Pinotage in particular. I was still at university then, and I spent my entire semester's book fund on buying a case and a half of Diemersfontein Pinotage, which tells you more about just how big my book fund was as opposed to the cost of this wine. And definitely then, for its heyday, you could pick up those light chocolate and coffee flavours. What's happened now is that Diemersfontein Pinotage has become the poster child for those particular flavours. There's a huge Pinotage festival they have every year, and this is a wine that's celebrated by many people. It's, again, not a terribly subtle wine in that sense. It's big, broad-shouldered, and it wears its coffee and chocolate badges very firmly on its chest. But it's a wine that's done extremely well. And if a wine is done well, that's good for the broader industry. It means people are drinking more wine, people are enjoying wine, and it means as a whole, I think, everybody wins. And nothing changes with this. It's a constant wine. It has those roast coffee flavours to it, those freshly roasted beans. Again, not really me, possibly because I don't drink coffee. I'm not a huge coffee fan. It's a little too much for me now. I think I liked it in its earlier days when it was slightly subtler, but it's still very pleasant. I'll still drink it very happily. We had some Diemersfontein Malbec on the show not that long ago, which I absolutely loved. But again, this fits into a very populist space. It's a wine that a lot of people have embraced and thoroughly enjoyed, and it shows that Diemersfontein have identified a market, they've made it work, and they've also inspired a whole pile of wines across South Africa. So again, personal taste, I'll enjoy it. I might have something else as a preference, but it's a wine that many, many people have taken to, have enjoyed, and have celebrated. And so Diemersfontein have certainly done well with this. It's been a great triumph in the South African wine industry, and it's had a huge impact on wine as we know it at the moment in South Africa. And then to the last of the lot, and a wine that in the last decade has become known not just around South Africa, but right around the world. A number of times I'm in duty-free at an airport, or I'm at a restaurant somewhere around the world, and lo and behold, there is the chocolate block. Now, it does have a greatly appealing name. Who doesn't like chocolate? Who doesn't like wine together? Wow, this sounds fantastic. And it does come from a terrific estate. Boekenhoutskloof make, for me, some of the best wine in South Africa. I love their Syrah, and their Semillon is one of the best South Africa has. The chocolate block sits just above their other label, the Wolf Trap, which we know from their steakhouse competition and as being one of the most popular entry-level wines, red and white, in South Africa. It's great terroir. It's across the road from Haute Espoir, my good friend Rob Armstrong, and it's become an iconic South African wine. But is it there on its merits, or is it there because it's got a bit of gimmick to it? Let's give it a try. So this is just over 2/3 Syrah. It's a wine we associate with those chocolate and cocoa notes. It's a blend. There's some Grenache in there, some Cab Sauv. I think there's even a tiny touch of Viognier just to smooth things out at the very end. It's a wine that's done extraordinarily well, and that surely has to be more than it just being a chocolate gimmick. And you know what, it is a very nice wine. Yes, it is sold on the basis of having those chocolate notes, and possibly it's a little psychosomatic in that you drink it, you've seen the labelling, oh look, there's some lovely taste of Mars bar. But the chocolate's certainly more subtle than it is with the Chocoholic. That might be your more entry-level wine in terms of chocolate wine coming together and moving into the wine space. This has got more subtlety to it. Yes, the chocolate is there, but it's not as pronounced, certainly not as pronounced as the label might suggest, and it's got a very nice balance to it. It's made by guys who know their wine. Mark and Tim. Tim's sadly no longer with us, but Mark and Tim, also the guys behind Vinimark, they've done a huge amount for wine in South Africa, and in the chocolate block, they've not only done well for themselves, they've also given us another wine that is flying the South African wine flag around the world. Couple that with the fact that, given its chocolate entry point, there are a lot of people who'll try it just for that and hopefully then enter more of the wine world. I think this wine, like the others, serves a really important purpose. So 4 wines that are very pronounced in what they are. They are absolutely open with it. They're trying to play on those coffee and chocolate flavours, and those hit the palate perfectly for many, many people. The Chocoholic, hugely chocolate. There's a lot of coffee in that cafe culture. The Diemersfontein, as we know, has always been like that. And this chocolate block, certainly the most subtle of the lot, a wine I'll happily drink again, and a wine that reflects why Boekenhoutskloof does make such terrific wine. So if you're watching this, you haven't drunk a huge amount of wine before, but you like chocolate, you like coffee, get a bottle of Chocoholic, try some of that cafe culture, start yourself off, make your way through the wine list, and just as I started in my late teens getting to know wine, 19, 20 years old, starting to understand it, now 15 years later or thereabouts, it's something that I find I have a far greater appreciation of. We all have to start somewhere. Maybe that's your starting point. Cheers.